October had always been quieter than the other months in our neighborhood. The leaves fell lazily from the oak trees lining the streets, leaving a blanket of orange and brown on the ground that crunched underfoot. The chill in the air arrived a bit too early this year, forcing everyone to dig out their coats and scarves from closets that hadn't been opened in months. It was a week before Halloween, and the neighborhood was already transforming. The familiar plastic skeletons dangled from front porches, fake cobwebs draped over hedges, and jack-o'-lanterns were starting to make their yearly appearance on doorsteps. Normally, I would have been more excited. Halloween had always been my favorite holiday growing up, but this year was different. I didn't feel like decorating. I didn't feel like carving pumpkins. After everything that had happened last year, I just wanted to get through the season quietly. I hadn't even bought candy for the trick-or-treaters yet, and I was trying to convince myself that I wouldn't need to. I thought maybe this year I could just turn off all the lights, pretend I wasn't home, and wait for the night to pass. No one would miss me. After all, there were plenty of other houses that were more enthusiastic than mine. It wasn't until that Thursday night, when the knock came, that everything changed. It was late, too late for visitors, especially for kids. I glanced at the clock on the microwave. 10:34 p.m. Strange. I hadn't expected anyone, and I certainly hadn't seen anyone on the street. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I hesitated. Normally I would have ignored it, but something about the knock, 3 short taps, then 2 slow ones, made my skin crawl. It was an odd rhythm, almost as if it was rehearsed, like whoever was on the other side had done this before. Against my better judgment, I walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. First, I thought no one was there. The porch light I had forgotten to turn on left the front of the house draped in shadows. But then I saw movement. A small figure standing at the very edge of the porch, barely illuminated by the street lamp across the road. A child, dressed in a faded, threadbare costume. A black cloak hung loosely over their small frame, the hood pulled low over their face. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette. My first thought was that it must be one of the neighborhood kids, out too late and lost on their way home. But something was off. Halloween was still a week away, and I hadn't seen any other kids trick-or-treating this early. Plus, the costume. It looked old, not in the charming, handmade way, but like it had been worn too many times, like it had been pulled out of a dusty attic where it had sat forgotten for years. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the doorknob, debating whether to open it or not. Maybe the kid was lost, I told myself. Maybe they needed help. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The air around me felt heavier, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a decision. Another knock, this time louder. I jumped, my heart racing. I couldn't leave them out there, not if they were in trouble. I reached for the lock and twisted it, pulling the door open just a crack. The cold air rushed in, making me shiver. The child didn't move. They just stood there, heads slightly tilted up as if they were looking at me, but I still couldn't see their face under the hood. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. No response, just silence. I glanced around, half expecting someone else to be hiding in the shadows, maybe playing some kind of prank, but the street was empty. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed muted. "Do you need help?" I asked again, louder this time. The figure shifted, just slightly, before holding out a hand. I hadn't noticed it before, but they were holding something, a small, worn-out paper bag. It looked old, crumpled at the edges, and stained in places I couldn't identify. "What's that?" I asked, more out of reflex than curiosity. Still no answer. They just held the bag out further, as if urging me to take it. I hesitated again, my gut telling me to shut the door and forget this ever happened. But instead, I reached out and took the bag. The moment my fingers touched the crinkled paper, a chill shot up my arm. It was colder than it should have been, like it had been left outside in the frost for hours. "Thanks," I said awkwardly, not sure what else to do. But before I could say anything more, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, frozen, watching as they vanished into the night without so much as a sound. No footsteps, no rustling of leaves. Just gone. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake. I stared at the bag in my hand, my fingers numb from the cold. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to throw it away, but something about it drew me in. Against my better judgment, I set it down on the kitchen counter and sat down at the table, just staring at it for a long time. Could have left it there, forgotten it. But as the minutes passed, my curiosity got the better of me. I reached for the bag, unrolling the top slowly. Inside was something small, wrapped in a torn piece of newspaper. My hands were shaking as I pulled the object out. The paper fell away, revealing a single small item, an old, weathered key. It was rusty, bent slightly, and looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was something etched into the handle, but it was too worn to read clearly. I stared at the key, confused. What was this for? Why had that kid given it to me? And why did it feel like this wasn't the end, but just the beginning? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure at my door, and that key. The key sat on my kitchen counter, its rusted metal glinting faintly in the dim light. I couldn't take my eyes off it. For something so small, it carried an enormous weight. I knew I should have thrown it away, should have tossed it into the trash along with the memories of the strange child that had delivered it. But something about it was pulling me in. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like this key had a purpose, one that involved me whether I liked it or not. That night I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I jolted awake with the same image burning in my mind. That kid, standing silently on my porch, his hand outstretched with the worn paper bag, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. I told myself it was just a prank, some overeager kid starting Halloween early. But it didn't explain the key, or why, when I touched it, my skin tingled with cold, even though the house was warm. Morning came too soon, and the pale autumn light spilling through the windows did little to shake the uneasy feeling. I went about my routine as normally as I could, making coffee, checking emails, avoiding the counter where the key still sat. But every now and then, my eyes would dart to it, and the same questions would echo through my mind. Asterisk, what does it open? Where does it go? Asterisk. Around noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the key, determined to figure it out. There was something etched into the handle, but the rust and wear had obscured it. I tried rubbing the surface with my thumb, hoping to reveal some clue. After a minute, the faint outline of a number appeared. Asterisk 13 star. My heart skipped a beat. 13. The number alone wasn't particularly ominous, but combined with everything else, It felt like a sign. A bad one. I stared at the key in the palm of my hand, feeling the chill from the metal seep into my skin. It was just a number, but something about it gnawed at me. My house wasn't big, so it didn't take long to realize that this key didn't belong to anything inside. I tried it on every lock I could think of. The front door, the back door, the basement, the old chest my grandmother had given me that I hadn't opened in years. Nothing. That should have been it. I should have accepted that the key wasn't mine, that it had no place in my life. But I couldn't let it go. The way it had appeared, delivered by that strange kid in the middle of the night, felt deliberate. There was something out there that had opened, and I wasn't going to rest until I found it. The thought of asking my neighbors crossed my mind, but I dismissed it quickly. I wasn't ready to be the guy who wandered around the block, asking if anyone had lost a creepy old key. Besides, no one else had seen the kid. I would have heard about it if they had. Instead, I went for a walk. It was something I did whenever I needed to clear my head, and it usually worked. But this time, as I strolled through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, the key weighed heavily in my pocket, a constant reminder of the mystery I couldn't shake. I walked further than usual that day, past the row of houses I knew so well, down the hill toward the older part of town. This was the section people rarely ventured to anymore. The houses here were different. Older, more run down, with peeling paint and broken windows that had long since been boarded up. Some of them had been abandoned for years. I hadn't been down here in ages, but something had drawn me in today. I don't know when I first noticed the house, but when I did, I stopped in my tracks. It was set back from the road, hidden by overgrown bushes and the branches of a massive oak tree that seemed to lean protectively over it. The house itself was a mess. Its roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark, framed by shutters that were barely hanging on. It looked like it hadn't seen life in decades. And then I saw it. The faded brass number nailed to the front door. 13. My stomach twisted into knots. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. There were plenty of houses in town with the number 13. It didn't mean anything. But even as I thought it, I knew I was wrong. This was the place. I could feel it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the house, the key burning a hole in my pocket. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around, to go home and forget about the whole thing. But something deep inside me, something darker and more curious, pushed me forward. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, and the overgrown grass brushed against my legs as I walked up the cracked stone path toward the front door. The air around the house felt heavier, like it was thick with the weight of years, of memories long forgotten. I reached the porch and paused, looking up at the number above the door. 13. My hand shook as I pulled the key from my pocket. It was cold, colder than before, almost painfully so. I held it up to the lock, hesitating for a split second before sliding it in. The moment the key entered the lock, something shifted. The air grew colder, and for the briefest moment, I thought I heard something. A whisper, maybe, or the sound of distant footsteps. I twisted the key. The lock clicked. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark hallway beyond. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with closed doors on either side. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the far end of the hallway, there was a door. It was different from the others, newer somehow and slightly ajar. Something moved behind it. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. The door creaked open wider, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. just a shadow, a fleeting glimpse of movement. But it was enough to send my heart racing. I wasn't alone in this house. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. It echoed through the hallway, soft but insistent, like it had been waiting for me all this time. Come closer. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave and never come back. But instead, I took a step forward, drawn by the voice, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. I couldn't explain why I kept walking forward. It felt like something had taken hold of me, pulling me down the hallway, toward the door that had creaked open just a little too wide. The air inside the house was stale, the smell of dust thick in my throat. The floorboards groaned under my weight as if protesting my every step. Come closer, the voice repeated, softer now, more of a whisper. I didn't want to. Every rational part of me screamed to leave, to turn around and forget I had ever found this place. But the pull was stronger than the fear. I wasn't just curious anymore. Felt like I needed to know what was behind that door. Like I'd been searching for it my whole life without even knowing it. I glanced around the hallway as I moved. The walls were bare, no pictures, no mirrors, nothing that suggested anyone had lived here for a long time. The closed doors on either side seemed ominous in their stillness, as if something was waiting behind each one. My breathing was shallow, the tension in my chest tightening with every step. When I reached the door at the end of the hallway, I paused. It was newer than the others, as if someone had replaced it recently. The wood didn't match the rest of the house. No paint peeling, no signs of decay. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong here. Yet it was slightly ajar, the crack wide enough for me to see darkness beyond. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers brushing the smooth wood. The coldness I felt earlier surged back into me, a biting chill that made my skin crawl. My hand hovered over the door for what felt like an eternity, and then, without thinking, I pushed it open. The door swung inward with a low creak, revealing a small room. At first glance, it seemed empty. No furniture, no windows, just the faint glow of light filtering in from the hallway behind me. But then I saw it. In the far corner, there was a figure, hunched over, unmoving. I stepped inside, heart pounding in my ears, and as I did, the door swung shut behind me. The sound echoed through the room, startling me. I spun around, gripping the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Panic rose in my throat. The voice came again, louder this time, but still soft. Come closer. The figure in the corner hadn't moved. It was crouched low, almost folded in on itself, its head down and hands covering its face. My mind raced. This wasn't right. I needed to get out. But the room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in, the air growing colder with every passing second. Who are you? I stammered, taking a small step forward. The figure shifted slightly, its head lifting just enough for me to catch a glimpse of a face, or what I thought was a face. It was hard to make out, shrouded in shadow, but there was something unsettling about it, something wrong with the way it looked back at me. It wasn't the face of a person. It was distorted, hollow. I've been waiting, the voice said, and I realized with a start that it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the room itself, echoing off the walls, seeping into my mind. I backed up, my hands fumbling for the door again. My fingers scraped against the wood, desperately searching for the keyhole, but there was nothing. The door had no keyhole, no lock, no way out. Let me out, I whispered, panic rising in my chest. The figure in the corner stirred again, its limbs unfolding slowly. It rose to its feet in a jerky, unnatural movement. The room was too dark for me to see it clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching me, waiting. "Who are you?" I repeated, louder this time, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure stepped forward, moving into the faint light from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. It was a boy, no, not a boy, but something that resembled one. His face was pale, too pale, like the life had been drained from it. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull, black and hollow, and his mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. "I've been waiting for you," the boy said, but the voice was wrong. It wasn't coming from his lips. It echoed in the air around me, the same voice I had heard all along. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I needed to get out. I needed to find a way out of this room, this house. But the boy, or whatever he was moving closer now, his steps slow and deliberate. "You took the key," the voice said. "You opened the door. Now it's your turn." "My turn for what?" I asked, my voice trembling. I pressed myself against the door, my mind spinning with fear. "To wait," the voice whispered, chilling me to the bone. The boy was inches away from me now, his eyes locked on mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His cold hand reached out, fingers brushing my arm, and in that moment, I felt it, the overwhelming sense of dread of being trapped. The room seemed to spin, and my vision blurred. Everything went dark. When I woke, I was no longer in the room. I was back in my house, lying on the floor in my living room, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. The sun had set, and the house was dark, except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. I had no idea how I had gotten back. My heart still raced, the memory of the boy's hollow eyes fresh in my mind. The key was cold in my hand, colder than before. I looked at the door to my basement. It had always been locked, the key long lost. But now, I had a feeling I knew exactly what the key in my hand would open. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the key in my hand, the weight of what I had just experienced pressing down on me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, the boy, the voice, the house. None of it seemed real, but the chill clinging to my skin and the dread sitting heavy in my chest told me it was. Somehow, it all led back to this key. My gaze drifted toward the basement door. It had been locked for years, ever since I bought the house. The realtor had mentioned something about it, how the previous owners had lost the key, and that the basement was mostly unfinished, probably filled with junk. I never thought much of it. In fact, I had forgotten it was even there, content to live my life above ground, never questioning what lay beneath. But now it felt like everything had been leading to this moment. The key in my hand was meant for that door. I could feel it. The cold metal was almost vibrating, as if it was urging me forward, calling me to finish what I'd started. I stood slowly, my legs shaky, and made my way to the basement door. The air in the house seemed to grow colder with every step, the shadows in the corners deepening, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle, the key burning cold in my palm. "Don't do this," a voice in the back of my mind warned. Just leave. Forget about the key, about the boy, about everything. But I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to know why this was happening. Why me? What did that boy want? Taking a deep breath, I slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, like it had always belonged there. The lock clicked with a sound that seemed to echo through the house, far louder than it should have been. I twisted the handle and pulled the door open. A musty, damp smell wafted up from the darkness below, the air thick with years of dust and neglect. The basement stairs descended into blackness, the faint glow from the hallway barely illuminating the top step. I stood there for a moment, staring into the void, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the final door. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness as I stepped onto the first creaky stair. The wooden boards groaned under my weight as I descended slowly, one step at a time. The further down I went, the colder the air became, wrapping around me like icy fingers. When I reached the bottom, I swept the flashlight around the room. The basement was larger than I'd expected. The walls lined with old shelves stacked with forgotten boxes, broken furniture, and rusted tools. It looked like no one had been down here in decades. But something was off. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, like the room itself was watching me. And then I saw it. In the far corner, half hidden behind a stack of old boxes, was another door. It was small, barely big enough for a person to fit through, and made of thick, heavy wood. Unlike the rest of the basement, this door wasn't covered in dust. It looked new, like someone had recently installed it. My heart raced as I approached it. This was what the key was for, I knew it. The moment I touched the door, a familiar coldness seeped into my bones. The same chill I'd felt when the boy had handed me the key. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the handle. For a second, I considered turning back, leaving the basement and never coming down here again. But it was too late. I had come too far. With a deep breath, I turned the handle. The door swung open silently, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. The flashlight flickered as I shone it inside, the beam barely reaching the end of the corridor. The walls were made of rough stone, damp and uneven, and the floor sloped downward, leading deeper into the earth. Something moved at the far end of the passage. A figure, small and hunched, stood in the shadows, its back turned to me. My heart nearly stopped. It was the boy, the same boy from the house. He hadn't seen me yet, or maybe he didn't care. He just stood there, staring at something in the darkness ahead. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The boy didn't answer. He didn't move. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the passageway, the cold stone floor slick beneath my feet. I walked slowly, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I closed the distance between us. The closer I got, the more I could see. The boy's cloak was tattered and frayed, his hood pulled low over his face. But as I reached him, something strange happened. He vanished. I blinked, my flashlight beam sweeping the empty space where he had stood. He was gone just like that, as if he had never been there at all. But I didn't have time to process it, because at the end of the passage, I saw it. Another door. This door was different from the others. It was massive, made of dark, aged wood, with thick iron hinges. It didn't belong in a basement, let alone in this house. It looked ancient, as though it had been here long before the house had ever been built. I approached slowly, the cold air growing more intense with every step. My hand shook as I reached for the door's iron handle, but I hesitated. Something about this door felt final. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the door open. The darkness beyond was absolute, but as I stepped through, something shifted. I was no longer in the basement. The air changed, becoming thick and suffocating. The smell of damp earth replaced by something far more foul. I looked around, but there were no walls, no ceiling, just an endless void of black, stretching out in every direction. And then I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving toward me from the edges of the darkness. They were formless at first, but as they grew closer, they took shape. Faces, human faces, twisted, hollow, and filled with a deep, unimaginable sorrow. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The shadows surrounded me, their faces leering in the dim light, their mouths moving in silent whispers. I couldn't hear the words, but I could feel them, the weight of their suffering pressing down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. And then I understood. The boy, the key, the doors, it was all a cycle, a trap. I had been drawn in just like so many others before me. This place thrived on fear, on the hopelessness of those who entered its doors. And now I was a part of it. I tried to fight, but it was useless. The shadows closed in, their cold hands reaching for me, pulling me into the void. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the boy, standing at the edge of the shadows, watching, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. And then, just as he had said, it was my turn to wait. Forever.